All right, so a couple months ago, I made a video, and that video was this one. It was titled, as you can see, "Don't Let Biden Use This Moment to Expand the Police/Surveillance State." And so, if you look at the date in this video, it was 3 days after the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol building. And the reason why I made this video was because I know who Joe Biden is. I know that he pushed for things like the Patriot Act, which was probably the most egregious intrusion on American civil liberties in modern history by the United States government. He was in favor of things like that. And so knowing that and knowing how the establishment, the government, usually uses moments of crises in order to expand their own powers, this was really predictable to think that Joe Biden and the person that he is would use a moment like January 6th, take it out of context, hyper-sensationalize it in the wrong ways, and then use it to expand the police and surveillance state. And it looks like, unfortunately, that this has come fully to fruition. So Biden team may partner with private firms to surveil suspected domestic terrorists online. So they're privatizing spying on US civilians, if you needed a quick translation of that. Let me read to you some of the details, and we're going to talk about how ridiculous and absurd this is and how we absolutely 100% cannot accept this as normal. So they say the Biden administration is considering using outside firms to track extremist chatter by Americans online, an effort that would expand the government's ability to gather intelligence, but could draw criticism over surveillance of US citizens. Yeah, no shit. The Department of Homeland Security is limited in how it can monitor citizens online without justification and is banned from activities like assuming false identities to gain access to private messaging apps used by extremist groups such as the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or Antifa or any of these other left-wing factions or groups that you want to talk about. So let's read that again. The Department of Homeland Security, so they're banned from monitoring citizens without justification, even though they do all the time, but they're supposedly banned from surveilling US citizens without justification and banned from doing things like assuming false identities in order to gain access to private messaging apps with these groups. So they're banned from doing that legally right now. Instead, federal authorities can only browse through unprotected information on social media sites like Twitter and Facebook and use other open online platforms. The plan being discussed now inside the DHS, according to multiple sources, would in effect allow the department to circumvent those limits. A source familiar with the effort said it is not about decrypting data, but rather using outside entities who can legally access these private messaging groups to gather large amounts of information that could help the DHS identify key narratives as they emerge. So, do you understand what they're doing here? They're openly saying, we are not legally allowed to monitor US citizens and use these specific practices in order to gain intelligence on them, but if we just hire someone else to do it, then that's no longer illegal. I mean, this is like perfectly analogous to what the United States does overseas with our foreign policy. So the United States, if you didn't know, has multiple times more private military contractors in countries like Afghanistan than we do actual like boots on the ground counted troops. So in Afghanistan, there's like 2,500 US troops on the ground, but there's many, many more thousands of private military contractors. Another word for those is you can call them mercenaries. So this reminds me of how the United States operates with those mercenaries. So instead of having US official troops go in and murder innocent civilians, which they do oftentimes, but instead of just doing that out in the open, we have our private military contractors or our mercenaries go in and do a lot of the dirty work for us. And then suddenly these things don't count as unconstitutional or they don't count as illegal because we have covert people doing it or private corporations doing it instead of having the US government do it directly. It's still illegal, it's still crimes, it's still terrible, but because it's one step removed and we're involving the private sector, suddenly now it's okay. So that's what they're trying to do here with surveillance. So they continue on. By partnering with research firms who have more visibility in this space, the DHS could produce information that would likely be beneficial to both it and the FBI, which can't monitor US citizens in this way without first getting a warrant or having the pretext of an ongoing investigation. The CIA and NSA are also limited on collecting intelligence domestically. I mean, what? They're just openly saying this. They're just openly saying, well, usually we wouldn't be able to get access to this information other than with a warrant and actual justification for needing access to that information. And instead, they're just saying, well, we're just going to do a little sleazy loop around here so that we don't need a warrant or justification. We can just spy on whoever the fuck we want for whatever reasons we want without having to provide any courts, any systems with accountability, a justification. That's what they're saying right now. This is absolutely ridiculous. They continue, it would, however, involve empowering a unit at the DHS that is already under fierce scrutiny for its bungled handling of the Portland riots last summer, an episode that included collecting intelligence reports on journalists and unmasking private citizens, according to a source familiar with a recent internal report on the matter. So they're admitting, one, we're not legally allowed to do these things, so we're just going to use a private contractor as a middleman and pretend as if they're not illegal anymore. And then two, we've already proven ourselves to not be trustworthy in doing these types of things. Literally last year, in the Portland riots, the Portland protests and riots, and all over the United States, which they were doing the same thing. We saw Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, all of these other organizations going and kidnapping people off of the streets, right? In those unmarked vans that we saw. We saw them shooting at journalists in many cases, police shooting at journalists, people going up and taking pictures of journalists. There was a video the other week that came out where, I forget where it was, but at one of these protests in one of these major cities, they were stopping journalists and having them take their pictures and track down their information for whatever purposes. They didn't tell anybody what it was for. But so this is what they're doing. They've already proven that they can't be trusted with this shit. And so this entire situation that we have going on here, the expansion of the police and the surveillance state, is predicated on what? Well, it's predicated and they're justifying it by saying, oh, well, the January 6th insurrection only happened because we didn't have adequate access to information on these groups, that they were going to be violent on that day or that they were going to attack the Capitol building. That is 100% false. What happened on January 6th, the insurrection, was not a matter of a lack of intelligence. And how do I know that? Well, I know that because I knew that that was going to happen. I didn't know exactly that it would unfold in the way that it did, but many leftists and many people in general were talking about the lead up to this. They were openly planning their Stop the Steal rally and publicly saying on all of these other forums, oh, well, this is our last stand. This is where we fight for our president, Donald Trump, and he won the election. They were openly telegraphing that they were going to be violent on this day. They were openly telegraphing that their intention was to stop the counting of the electoral votes, to stop the certification of the electoral vote count. They were openly saying all these things. So it wasn't a matter of a lack of intelligence. It's not as if they didn't know that this was going to happen. They intentionally failed. We saw this evidenced by things like this. U.S. Capitol Police officer allegedly told units to only monitor for anti-Trump protesters on January 6th. And listen, this is just one of the stories. We saw a bunch of other stories as to how the U.S. Capitol Police were significantly understaffed. They were significantly under-equipped for this moment. And that was all because of specific choices by people in power. They didn't want to stop the Trump supporters from entering the U.S. Capitol. They didn't fight them. They didn't put up a serious resistance. We've seen significantly more security at any of these Black Lives Matter protests than we saw at the Capitol building on January 6th. So it wasn't a matter of a lack of police, so you don't need to expand the police state. It wasn't a matter of lack of intelligence, so you don't need to expand the surveillance state. And yet, that's exactly what the fuck they're doing now. So the same message that I made in that video on January 9th, a couple days after this happened, is this is what exactly we were talking about back then. This is what we were warning of. This is Biden using a moment where Americans were uncertain, fearful of what happened. We didn't know how to control it. We didn't know how to stop it. And so the U.S. government steps in, and they're going to use this as an opportunity to expand their own power. They're going to use this as an opportunity to expand the surveillance in the police state. It's absolutely unacceptable. This will 100%, as evidenced again by things like this, and all of U.S. history involving the CIA and the FBI, this will 100% be used to crack down on leftists. This will 100% be used to crack down on socialists and communists, more so than it is used to crack down on fascists and white supremacists. That is a guarantee. I mean, if you look at examples, there was one story I read recently about the FBI, and you can go look this up to fact check me, but there was one period where the FBI, while they were fighting the KKK, made up about 20% of the KKK's total membership. The FBI did. And they didn't stop any of the violent attacks of the KKK. They wrote this. They admitted this in court in testimony. They didn't stop any of the KKK's violence. In fact, they participated in the violence in many circumstances. And they didn't end up hurting the KKK at all. If anything, they just expanded their membership. So you cannot trust the FBI, the CIA, any of these institutions to be fair, or let alone even crack down on these white supremacists. That's not what's going to happen. This is purely just an excuse. While they may take down some white supremacist groups in the process, this is an excuse to do a widespread crackdown on anybody who has a dissenting opinion on anything. So that means everybody from white supremacists on occasion to leftists to socialists to communists, all down the line. So it's absolutely unacceptable. There has to be massive pushback on this. Anybody who even marginally pretends to care about free speech should be completely up in arms about this and vehemently and publicly opposing it.